The cemetery lay shrouded in the embrace of the night, a landscape of eerie silence and shadow. Moonlight struggled to pierce through the dense canopy of clouds above, casting an otherworldly glow on the tombstones that rose like teeth from the earth. The air was thick with a chilling mist weaving between the graves like a ghostly serpent, cloaking the ground in a spectral haze. In the suffocating stillness of the warehouse, the oppressive weight of midnight pressed heavily upon Steve, the worker of the graveyard shift. As his eyes fluttered shut, he slipped into a slumber, unaware of the nightmare that awaited him in the depths of his subconscious. In his dream, Steve found himself in an ancient, decrepit cathedral, its walls seeping with a centuries-old malice. Grotesque gargoyles leered from above, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the ground beneath his feet was slick with something dark and unnameable. He walked down the aisle, each step resonating through the unholy sanctuary as haunting chants filled the air. The pews were lined with shadowy figures, their faces obscured, whispering in a language that twisted the soul. Ahead of him, an altar bathed in an eerie, blood-red light. As Steve approached, the scene on the altar revealed itself in all its macabre glory. Demonic entities, their forms twisted and contorted, writhed in a dance of eternal torment. In the center, a chasm opened, revealing a glimpse into the infernal depths, where screams of the damned echoed endlessly. Steve's partner, Mike, was startled by Steve's muffled cries. He approached Steve, only to freeze in horror at the sight unfolding before him. On Steve's arm, a story was materializing, the words and images forming a narrative of the nightmare Steve was experiencing. The words were written in a script that seemed to twist and turn, the ink appearing like trickles of blood seeping through his skin. As Mike read, the warehouse around them began to shift and warp. The walls groaned and bled, shadows stretching into sinister shapes. The air turned cold and a wind began to howl as if echoing the chants from Steve's nightmare. Then, the nightmare spilled into reality. From the shadows, the demonic creatures emerged, their eyes burning with an unholy fire. The ground cracked open, revealing a gaping maw leading to the underworld. The shadowy figures from the pews appeared, their whispers growing into a cacophony of madness. Mike, consumed by fear, tried to run, but the creatures were upon him. They grasped him with clawed hands, pulling him towards the abyss. His screams were drowned out by the hellish chorus as he was dragged into the chasm, disappearing into the underworld. Steve awoke with a start, his heart pounding, sweat drenching his skin. He looked around, the warehouse returned to its former state, but the darkness lingered, a reminder of the horror that had just unfolded. On his arm, the story remained, the words and images etched into his skin, a permanent testament to the nightmare that had become a terrifying reality. The warehouse was silent now, but the silence was deceptive. Something had been awakened, a darkness that had crossed over from the realm of nightmares. Steve sat there, alone and terrified, knowing that this was only the beginning of something far more horrifying than he could have ever imagined. The morning after the horrific events at the warehouse, the grim reality of Mike's disappearance and the enigmatic scar on Steve's arm left him reeling. The warehouse, once just a mundane backdrop to his nightly routine, now felt like a mausoleum of his sanity. The police had come and gone, attributing Mike's disappearance to an unexplained accident, but Steve knew better. He could not unsee the horrors that had unfolded before his eyes. Haunted by the night's terrors, Steve sought refuge in the office of Dr. Elena Hartman, a psychotherapist known for her work with unexplained psychological phenomena. The office was a stark contrast to the warehouse's darkness, adorned with soothing colors and soft lighting, yet it did little to ease Steve's unease. "Tell me about the nightmare, Steve," Dr. Hartman urged gently, her voice a calming balm to his frayed nerves. Steve recounted the nightmare, his voice trembling. It was like I was in another world, a cathedral of horrors, demonic creatures, shadows, and the chanting. It was all too real. Dr. Hartman listened intently, her brow furrowed. "And the scar on your arm, it appeared during this nightmare?" "Yes," Steve replied, pulling up his sleeve to reveal the sinister script and images. "It's like the nightmare wrote itself onto me." The doctor leaned closer, examining the scar. "This is most unusual. I've heard of psychosomatic responses, but this is something else." Steve's eyes darted around the room, a sense of paranoia creeping in. "You believe me, don't you? The police think I'm making this up, but I swear it's all real." Dr. Hartman nodded. "I do believe you, Steve, but we need to delve deeper into your subconscious to understand this. Have you experienced anything like this before?" "No, never," Steve said, his gaze distant. "But there's something else. When my partner, he read it, and then the nightmare came to life." A chill ran down Dr. Hartman's spine. "Came to life?" Steve nodded, his eyes filled with fear. "The creatures from the nightmare, they took him, they dragged him into the darkness." The doctor leaned back, her mind racing. "We need to explore these nightmares further, Steve. I believe you're experiencing something beyond the scope of normal psychology, but be assured, I will help you get to the bottom of this." As Steve left the office, the weight of his secret nightmare world weighed heavily on him. The scar on his arm seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a constant reminder of the dark forces that had breached the veil of his reality. Steve returned home, his heart heavy with a terror he could hardly articulate. Megan greeted him with a warm smile, but it faltered as she saw the distress etched deep into his features. "Megan," Steve began, his voice quivering. "Something happened at work. Something terrible." Megan's eyes widened with concern. "What happened, Steve? You're scaring me." Steve recounted the nightmarish events at the warehouse, the horror that had claimed his partner. Megan listened, her face a mask of disbelief and worry. "But that's impossible, Steve. Nightmares don't just come to life." "I know how it sounds," Steve said, showing her the sinister scar on his arm. "But I'm not making this up. It's real, Megan. It's dangerously real." Megan moved closer, wrapping her arms around him. "We'll get through this, Steve. Whatever this is, we'll face it together." That night, as they lay in bed, the world outside was quiet, but a storm was brewing within the walls of their bedroom. Steve's breathing grew erratic, his body convulsing in the grip of another monstrous nightmare. In his dream, Steve was trapped in a realm of eternal damnation, a grotesque theater of suffering. Around him, the landscape was a twisted vision of hell. Rivers of boiling blood flowed, carrying the screaming souls of the damned. Demonic entities, their bodies a grotesque fusion of man and beast, roamed the land, their roars echoing amidst the songs of suffering. The sky was ablaze with a crimson glow, casting a sickening light over the scene. In the center, a massive pit belched fire and brimstone, the gateway to deeper horrors. Sinners were dragged by chains towards this pit, their pleas for mercy drowned by the relentless laughter of demons. Megan awoke to the sound of Steve's tortured breathing, her heart racing with fear. She noticed a new, horrifying scene materializing on Steve's leg, a terrifying narrative etching itself into his flesh. "Oh my God, Steve, what's happening?" Megan gasped, her eyes fixed on the emerging scar. Steve, caught in the throes of his nightmare, was oblivious to her terror. Megan, driven by a desperate need to understand, began to read the nightmarish script. As she uttered the words, the room around them began to distort, shadows writhing like living things. The nightmare spilled into reality, the demonic entities from Steve's dream emerging from the walls, their eyes burning with malevolent glee. Megan screamed as they reached for her, their claws cold and merciless. Steve awoke to a room transformed into a scene from his nightmare, and to Megan's terror-filled screams. "Megan!" he cried, lunging towards her, but it was too late. The demons enveloped her, dragging her into the abyss of his nightmare. The room snapped back to normal, but Megan was gone, consumed by the unspeakable horror that had erupted from Steve's subconscious. Steve was left alone, his sobs filling the room, the weight of the truth crushing him. In a daze, Steve reached for the phone, his voice choked with tears. "Help. Please help me. Something's happened to Megan." As he waited for the police, the silence of the room was oppressive, the echoes of Megan's screams haunting him. The nightmare had breached the boundaries of his mind, claiming the one he loved most. The darkness within Steve had shown its true, terrifying power, and he knew that his life was now entwined with a horror beyond comprehension. The arrival of the police at Steve and Megan's home broke the eerie silence of the night. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, casting ominous shadows across the room where tragedy had unfolded. Steve, still in a state of shock, sat motionless as the officers entered. "Sir, can you tell us what happened here?" one of the officers asked, his tone cautious yet firm. Steve's voice was a hollow whisper. "It was the nightmare. It took her." The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of confusion and skepticism. "Nightmare, sir?" the second officer pressed. "We need a clear account of what transpired here." Steve tried to explain, his words tumbling out in a frantic, disjointed mess. He spoke of the nightmares, the scars, and how the horror had leapt from his own flesh to claim Megan. But his story, so filled with unbelievable horror, only deepened the officer's suspicions. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with us to the station," the first officer said, a hint of suspicion in his voice. "We have a lot more questions, and we need to sort this out." At the station, the interrogation room felt like a tomb, the air thick with accusation. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a harsh glow on Steve as he recounted his tale once more to a skeptical detective. "Mr. Wallace, you expect me to believe that a nightmare came to life and took your wife?" the detective asked, his eyebrows raised in disbelief. Steve's desperation was palpable. "You have to believe me, I didn't harm Megan. The nightmares are real, they're alive." The detective leaned back, his gaze steady on Steve. "Your story is hard to digest, Mr. Wallace. A man with a history of psychiatric consultation claiming nightmares are coming to life, it doesn't look good for you." Steve felt a cold dread settle in his heart. They didn't believe him. He was the prime suspect in a crime too horrific for words, a crime born from the darkest recesses of his own mind. That night, as Steve sitting in his cell, the haunting memories of Megan and the nightmare that had claimed her life swirled in his mind. The cell's darkness seemed to pulsate with unseen horrors, and every shadow seemed to whisper Megan's name. As sleep finally claimed him, Steve fell into another nightmare, more terrifying and cruel than any before. He found himself in a labyrinth of endless corridors, each twist and turn revealing scenes of unimaginable torment and despair. The walls were alive with the faces of the damned, their eyes pleading for an end to their eternal suffering. But this time, the nightmare did not stay confined to his mind. As Steve screamed in his sleep, a guard outside Officer Daniels noticed something happening in the cell. Curious, he peered through the bars, only to see images and script materializing on Steve's exposed skin. Fascinated and horrified, Officer Daniels read the nightmarish script, his eyes widening with terror as the horrors described began to manifest in the cell. Shadows twisted into malevolent forms, the air filled with the stench of brimstone, and unseen entities whispered vile promises. Frozen with fear, Officer Daniels could only watch as the nightmare enveloped him, the darkness and the creatures dragging him into their infernal domain. His screams echoed down the corridor, a chilling testament to the nightmare's power. The next morning, Steve awoke to find his cell surrounded by police. Officer Daniels was gone, vanished without a trace. The nightmare had claimed another victim, and all fingers pointed to Steve. As he was led away accused of a crime too nightmarish to believe, Steve realized the true extent of his curse. The nightmares were not just his own anymore, they were a horror unleashed upon the world, and he was powerless to stop them. The transfer from the police station to the psychiatric facility was a blur for Steve. His mind was a tumultuous sea of guilt, fear, and confusion. The facility, an imposing structure with barred windows and an air of desolation, loomed ominously as they approached. Upon arrival, Steve was greeted by Dr. Gregory Hayes, the head psychiatrist. Dr. Hayes was a man with a stern face and piercing eyes that seemed to look right through Steve. "Mr. Wallace, I've been briefed about your unique situation," Dr. Hayes began, his voice carrying a note of clinical curiosity. "I must admit, it's unlike anything I've encountered in my career." Steve, his voice barely audible, replied, "It's a nightmare, Doctor. It's taking everything from me." Dr. Hayes led Steve to his room, a sparse clinical space that felt more like a cell than a sanctuary. "We're going to do everything we can to help you, Mr. Wallace, but you must be completely honest with me." That night, as the facility settled into a quiet routine, Steve lay in his bed, the weight of his eyelids betraying him into sleep. And with sleep came the nightmares, more vivid and terrifying than ever. In this new nightmare, Steve found himself in a desolate city, the buildings twisted and charred, the streets filled with the anguished cries of the unseen. The sky was a tapestry of swirling darkness, from which descended creatures so horrifying they defied description. They were beings of pure nightmare, their forms shifting and changing, mouths filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. The ground beneath Steve cracked open, revealing a chasm that led to a deeper darkness, an abyss that pulsed with the screams of 1,000 tormented souls. From this abyss, hands reached out, grasping for salvation that would never come. A nurse on her rounds, Nurse Thompson, passed by Stevie's room and heard his tormented cries. Concerned, she entered to check on him. The sight that greeted her was beyond comprehension. Words and images were materializing on Steve's skin, depicting the hellish scene from his dream. Nurse Thompson, her eyes wide with horror, began to read the script, her voice trembling. As she read, the room began to twist and warp, the walls bleeding shadows, the air growing thick and suffocating. The creatures from Steve's nightmare began to emerge, their forms grotesque and terrifying. Nurse Thompson screamed as they turned their malevolent gaze upon her, their presence a suffocating oppression in the small room. Steve awoke to a scene of horror. Nurse Thompson was gone, consumed by the nightmare that had once again crossed the boundary into reality. The room was silent, but the echoes of her screams lingered. The next morning, the facility was in chaos. The disappearance of Nurse Thompson, following the unexplained incidents at the police station, only deepened the mystery surrounding Steve. Dr. Hayes, his face a mask of concern and fear, confronted Steve. "Mr. Wallace, what happened last night? Nurse Thompson is missing, and the last thing she did was check on you." Steve's voice was a broken whisper. "The nightmares, they're real. They're claiming everyone around me." Dr. Hayes stepped back, the implications of Steve's words sinking in. The facility, once a place of healing and understanding, had become a stage for a horror that defied all logic and reason. Steve was isolated, placed in a secure room where he could harm no one else. But as he sat there, alone in his thoughts, he knew the truth. The nightmare was far from over. It was growing, feeding on his fear and the souls it claimed. And Steve was at the center of it all, a prisoner of his own mind, where the horrors of the night were all too eager to escape into the waking world. In the depths of the psychiatric facility, Steve's isolation room became a crucible for the darkest fears of the human psyche. Dr. Hayes, though wary, was determined to unravel the mystery of Steve's condition. He entered the room, his recorder in hand, ready to document everything. "Mr. Wallace, I need you to describe your nightmares to me," Dr. Hayes began, his voice steady despite the palpable tension in the air. Stevie, his eyes hollow from sleepless terror, whispered, "It's like peering into hell itself." As Stevie recounted his nightmares, the air in the room grew denser, the shadows seeming to retreat in anticipation. He spoke of a world where the sky was a perpetual eclipse, casting a sickly, blood-red hue over a land of damnation. Grotesque demons, their forms an unholy amalgamation of biblical beasts, and the twisted visions of a fevered mind roamed this landscape. They wielded whips of fire and barbed chains, hurting the damned souls who wailed in ceaseless agony. "The rivers run red with blood and pus, and the ground is littered with the remains of the tortured," Steve continued, his voice trembling. "There are creatures there, creatures of a nightmare, born from the deepest pits of despair and malice." Dr. Hayes, caught in the web of Steve's narrative, felt a chill run down his spine. He noticed to his horror that a new story was beginning to materialize on Steve's skin, the script winding like serpents down his arms and legs. "Stop, Steve. Please stop," Dr. Hayes stammered, his professional demeanor crumbling, but it was too late. The room around them began to distort, the walls pulsating with a life of their own. Demonic entities, their eyes burning with infernal fire, began to emerge from the walls, their roars shaking the very foundations of the facility. The scene from Steve's nightmare unfolded in the room, a tableau of hellish horror. The air was filled with the stench of brimstone and decay, and the screams of the damned filled the room, a symphony of endless suffering. Dr. Hayes, paralyzed by fear, could only watch as the demons advanced. They were monstrous beings, their forms an abomination against nature, with twisted horns, leathery wings, and claws sharp as razors. Their mouths were gaping maws of darkness, filled with rows of jagged teeth, ready to consume all in their path. The room transformed into a scene of apocalyptic terror, with fires burning and the ground cracking open, revealing chasms that led to the abyss. From these chasms, more creatures emerged, each more horrifying than the last. Steve, caught in the epicenter of this nightmare-made flesh, watched in horror as Dr. Hayes was consumed by the demons, his screams echoing in the now hellish chamber. The nightmare had reached its zenith, unleashing a horror that defied comprehension. Steve's world had become a living nightmare, a reality where the boundaries between sleep and wakefulness, sanity and madness, were irrevocably blurred. The ultimate nightmare had been unleashed, and there was no turning back from the abyss that had been opened. The remnants of the psychiatric facility stood as a harrowing testament to the unleashed terror, its ruins shrouded in an apocalyptic gloom. The sky above churned with ominous thunderclouds, casting the world below in a ghastly, unsettling light. Demonic shapes flitted across the stormy heavens, their screeches a harrowing soundtrack to the chaos that reigned. In the midst of this devastation, Steve lay amidst the rubble, his spirit as shattered as the world around him. A figure emerged from the swirling mists, a being woven from the nightmares of humanity, his presence an embodiment of every despicable act ever committed. Steve, his eyes reflecting the horrors he had seen, looked up at the approaching figure. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice a mere rasp. The figure, towering over Steve, spoke with a voice that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. "I am the harbinger of humanity's true face, the echo of its darkest deeds. I am born of the cruelty and depravity that festers in the heart of man." Steve shivered as the figure continued. "You, Steve Wallace, have been the vessel through which the darkness has spilled into this world. Your nightmares were but a prelude to the reality that now unfolds." Around them, the screams of the damned and the tormented filled the air, a cacophony of despair set against the backdrop of a relentless thunderstorm. "Why is this happening?" Steve pleaded, his voice breaking under the weight of his despair. "The world has long been steeped in its own malevolence," the figure intoned, his eyes like burning coals. "Wars, genocides, atrocities, a never-ending cycle of destruction. Humanity's capacity for cruelty has finally tipped the scales. What you see around you is the reckoning." Steve looked around, his heart sinking at the sight of demonic entities swooping down, their claws extended towards unseen victims. The air was thick with the stench of fear and suffering. "Is there no hope then? Is this the end?" Steve asked, a sense of helplessness washing over him. "Hope?" The figure let out a cold, humorless laugh. "Hope is but a fleeting dream in the face of reality. The concept of good and evil is a human construct, a veil over the inherent cruelty of your nature. This is the world stripped of its pretenses, a world where nightmares reign supreme." The figure's words cut through Steve like a knife. He realized that the horrors he had unleashed were not anomalies, but reflections of the very essence of humanity. "This is your legacy, Steve Wallace. You have opened the door to the abyss and there is no closing it now," the figure declared, his form blending into the shadows that enveloped the world. As the figure disappeared, Steve was left alone in the ruins, the screams and thunder a relentless reminder of the nightmare that had become reality. And in that darkness, Stevie understood the terrible truth. The nightmares were not just his to bear. They were humanity's legacy, a testament to the cruelty and horror that lay in the heart of every man. The darkness had come, and with it, the end of everything he had ever known.